Crypto has always been an ever growing, ever branching, ever morphing, evolving thing. One blockchain begets another, which then sparks the development of five more, each iteration seemingly limitless in its variation from its predecessors. But one question seems relevant to all versions of this technology: who governs? Who rules? Who gets to decide? Is it self-rule by the citizens or rule by the elite? These two things might seem superficially similar, but they are very different. Rule by consensus of even a seemingly benevolent elite might seem acceptable in the short term, but it always results in corruption on a long enough timeline. The good emperor and his elite and wise advisors always eventually give way to the bad successor emperor and his enforcers. If you're going to have any evolution at all, the only way to avoid this fate is transparent self-rule. And Cardano seems to be one of the very rare large cap ecosystems on the right track. Ready? Let's go. Today, we're going to discuss the stark contrast between Cardano and Ethereum in terms of plans for governance, why Bitcoin doesn't seem to need much governance at all in comparison. It's kind of a sad reason. How some in the traditional finance world are starting to understand an important pillar in crypto's future, an open airdrop that some of you might qualify for right now, and Artifct Moon announcing some progress. If you immediately knew this was not a screen cap from AC Odyssey because the toga of the gentleman in the center seems to be made out of his shoulder, or if you're finding value in these videos each weekday, please consider delegating to the Army of Spies stake pool, ticker AOS. Today, we're going to talk about what I think is one of the most important and probably neglected topics in all of crypto. That is governance, and specifically the difference between self-governance and this naive reliance on a seemingly benevolent elite. There's this thing in crypto, and it's this naive holding of a belief that if someone is a true crypto person, you can just trust them. It doesn't make any sense. It's counterintuitive because one of the most important tenets of crypto in general, of blockchains generally, is that you shouldn't have to trust anyone. Trustlessness is one of the great innovations brought to us by Satoshi's invention, trustlessness. But yet what we find with blockchain ecosystems over and over again is all kinds of talk of trustlessness, all kinds of propaganda touting the original ethos of crypto. But then when you get into the details, of course, the devil is always in the details. When you get in the details, you find all these points, all these bottlenecks, all these choke points where they're asking you to definitely trust someone. Why should you trust them? Because they're crypto guys. You should naively hold this belief that just because they're crypto guys, they're always going to do what's right. And sometimes it's true. Sometimes over short time frames, it turns out to be true that someone is a benevolent ruler, a benevolent dictator. It's very rare, but it does happen. And it happens probably even more commonly in crypto than in the traditional world because we all kind of came out of this original crypto thing. All of us know of the original ideas of the Bitcoin white paper. We're all to some extent exposed to those ideas. So maybe that's why it happens a little more often in crypto. But that's on a shorter time frame. Crypto's only been around a little bit over a decade. We're coming up now on a decade and a half. But crypto in the grand scheme of things has not been around very long at all. Over longer time frames, things change. Over longer time frames, even if you started out with this benevolent ruler and his elite but wise advisors making all the right decisions, or at the very least well-intentioned decisions in line with the same kinds of philosophical principles that the community around that blockchain are ascribing to, even if you start out with that kind of a benevolent elite guiding the development of a blockchain ecosystem, eventually it gives way to something else. And if you're really, really lucky, the successors are also at least somewhat benevolent. But as we go out further and further on this timeline, you eventually run into a successor group of elites who are not benevolent. They're malicious. They're just trying to extract as much as possible from the ecosystem. And we've also seen this in crypto. We've definitely seen the malicious governing elite. In fact, we've seen it iteratively over and over again, more so maybe in projects with all the rug pulls and the inside job exploits, all those kinds of things. We've seen malicious governing elites do the wrong thing just to extract value from the ecosystem. Over a long enough timeline, the successor is always going to be malicious. You'll always have a malicious successor, unless there's some kind of system, some kind of institution that prevents this from happening. In the absence of an institution or a system that prevents that, eventually you will have either a malicious successor or the originally benevolent ruling elites will become malicious. Why? Usually because of profit motive. Eventually, they want to cash in. Given that framework, given those ideas, to whatever extent you think what I just laid out may be true, to whatever extent you think it may be true, let's look at Cardano and, honestly, its biggest competitor, Ethereum. Let's see how they stack up in regards to this whole governance thing, where you either, in my opinion, you either have some kind of institution or system that prevents the malicious ruling elite, or you eventually end up with it on a long enough timeline. So, did you know that Vitalik has a website? Because Vitalik has a website, and this is it. Here's a post from December of 2017 in which he wrote that he argues the status quo of informal governance as practiced by Bitcoin, Bitcoin Cash, Ethereum, Zcash, and similar systems is much less bad than commonly thought. Do you hear that? Informal governance is much less bad than commonly thought. That people who think the purpose of blockchains is to completely expunge soft, mushy human intuitions and feelings in favor of completely algorithmic governance, emphasis on completely, are absolutely crazy. So you hear that? People who want to get rid of this human tendency to eventually give way to maliciousness, people who want to completely erase that, get rid of that, take that out of the equation, they are absolutely crazy. And if they are in favor of completely algorithmic governance, which is usually the solution you come to if you're trying to expunge this soft, mushy human intuition, if you're trying to expunge that, usually you come to algorithmic governance or on-chain governance, as we like to call it in crypto now. Those people, in Vitalik's opinion, in this article that he wrote at least, are absolutely crazy. And he goes on and on and on, trying to convince you that you don't really need to go to on-chain governance. You don't really need to use blockchains, which are the things that can give you trustlessness, to achieve trustlessness. Instead, all that's overrated. Instead, you just need to trust your benevolent governing elites, who are pretty much the only ones who are ever doing informal governance. It's like, if you have a large enough ecosystem, it's never called informal governance when everybody's governing, because that doesn't really work. If you have like tens of thousands of people involved in governance, it never really works on an informal basis. It only works on an informal basis. We only call it informal if it's a very small group of elites who get to do all the governing. But this wasn't just some crazy night in 2017 when Vitalik tried to drink tequila for the first time and decided to proclaim to the world his hatred of rule by the people. This goes on and on. Here's a post from August 2020, almost 3 years later, where he says, opposition to on-chain governance, it's bipartisan. And he posts the Bitcoin and Ethereum sort of doing the muscular shaking hands thing. And he has posts saying on-chain governance is a bug, not a feature, and on-chain governance is a disaster. Coin vote-based governance is a disgrace. Not only is on chain governance not preferable, it's a disaster, a bug, a disgrace. And you should oppose it, apparently, according to Vitalik. So, if Vitalik doesn't believe in on chain governance, how does it actually work today in Ethereum? Well, here's what Ethereum posted today. This is Tim Biko. He posted, once again, we locked all the core devs in a room for a week to work on cross client interoperability, this time on the top of a mountain in Austria. Here's a recap of our week long event a few weeks ago. And you can see beautiful alpine winter setting. But the important part is this is how things are happening. They just lock a bunch of elites in a room. And I'm going to call them elites because if you're the one getting to decide what happens in Ethereum, how Ethereum is built out, a gigantic economic ecosystem, you are an elite. This is how things happen in Ethereum, this informal consensus that Vitalik talks about, a small group of elites, sort of Vitalik's philosophy and everything being carried out by his wise elite advisors and builders. They basically build everything out. And you don't have any drama over community votes in Ethereum because there aren't community votes. There is no on-chain governance. There is no governance that everyone gets to participate in. You could argue that there certainly is input from the community. People are talking about everything all the time, but there's no big election. There's no big vote. It's just the elites deciding what happens. And nobody really complains as long as the price keeps going up. The problem here is exactly what Stake with Pride is pointing out. Ethereum is against on-chain governance. They're very against it. Vitalik has told you that over and over and over again. They're not going in the direction of on-chain governments. This means its roadmap will remain in the hands of a privileged few developers. On-chain governance will let you decide where Cardano goes. The thing is, crypto isn't the first time humans have engaged in governance. We have lots and lots of examples of governance. And what we know from those real world examples is that when you have a small group of elites making all the decisions forever, what you see is ossification. It becomes stale. The decision making isn't agile. They become neoconish. They get set in their ways. They can't respond well to changing circumstances. They don't have good outcomes. We see this with totalitarian regimes. Totalitarian regimes, at least in the modern world, don't seem to last that long. They eventually, the ossification leads to bad decision making and they get outperformed by democracies. Democracies seem to always outperform totalitarian governments where a small group of elites were making all the decisions because the totalitarian regimes, the elites, they get set in their ways. They're not agile. They can't change direction. You need those competing factions that all have equal footing, constantly evolving, constantly changing, alliances forming, alliances breaking. You need that, like you see in a democracy, in order for governance to be agile, to respond to changing circumstances. Ethereum, if it continues on this road, they're going to suffer the same fate that we've seen with totalitarian regimes. Eventually, they can't respond to changing circumstances because the ossification of the informal governance by the elites. But in an ecosystem like Cardano, where we're moving towards on-chain governance, you're going to have that competition of different factions and the agility that comes from that. So you might have a counterexample in your head though. You might be saying, what about Bitcoin? They don't have on-chain governance. Well, you might remember in the opening to this video, I said, if you're going to have any evolution at all, you need this kind of decentralized governance. You need this governance by the people. You need self-rule by the people. What we see in Bitcoin, the reason why they don't have self-rule by the citizens of the ecosystem. And the reason why we don't notice is because there's no evolution going on there. They don't change anything. They're already in that neocon stance. And because they don't change anything, there's no governance really to be done. I mean, there are little tiny things happening, but there's no real substantial progress. There's nothing to govern because they're not evolving. They're not making any progress. I would sum it up like this. Bitcoin will be outperformed by ecosystems that are actually evolving. And the free state of Cardano, where the citizens actually have self-governance, it will outperform the Ethereum Politburo. Here's something that surprised me, and it might surprise you too. Forbes just ran this article, and it looks a lot like the kinds of articles we're used to seeing in the traditional legacy media. So the title is How MasterCard, Goldman Sachs, and other TradFi titans are using blockchain to rewire global finance. And as a crypto person, when you see this kind of article, you automatically assume what it's going to be, that it's largely going to be about non-public blockchains, like not real crypto. These are going to be private permissioned blockchains they're talking about. That's what the TradFi titans love to be into. They don't want to be into public blockchains. They can't. It's hard for them to make money with public blockchains. But if you talk about permissioned blockchains where they control all the nodes, they're totally all about that. But there's something else in this article that surprised me. They do talk about that kind of stuff in this article, but there's something else in this article that kind of surprised me, that I thought was it kind of signals a new phase in thinking in TradFi, the way they're thinking about crypto. So this is the CEO of MasterCard, right? When I think about MasterCard, I don't think of cutting edge, crypto adoption. MasterCard is not the first place I think of, but he said something kind of interesting. He said, you can tokenize anything. I think we're going to have a world where everything will be tokenized and will be passed around in a safe fashion. This is interesting because even if he's totally embracing not crypto, but the permissioned blockchain thing like the rest of TradFi, he at least understands one thing, that tokenization of all types of assets is probably inevitable. And I don't know what the timeline on this is. There's lots of regulatory hurdles there, the kinds that we've talked about almost nonstop on this channel, but he does understand that tokenization of everything is probably inevitable because it's more efficient. It's much more efficient to transact tokenized real world assets and all kinds of assets on a blockchain than any of the other ways we're doing it. And I think once all of the traditional finance, actors, these large actors in traditional finance, once they understand that, they're going to attack it from the wrong angle. They're going to attack it from that permission blockchain angle. But I think where everything's going to end up is where we in, real crypto already are. Quick heads up about a free airdrop that some of you will be eligible for, and it may or may not be live when you're actually seeing this. But Virtua posted this. Claim is now live if you held a complete set of those 2021 Cardano Summit NFTs, which we talked about a lot on this channel, right up until we got them. We followed that whole process up until the point where we actually got those things. But if you hold a complete set of those 2021 Cardano Summit NFTs at the time of the Virtua November snapshot, and you haven't yet claimed a free miner bot, then you can do it right now. I actually had not been able to claim one of these yet, and I definitely have a complete set of those 2021 Summit NFTs, and it worked. I went in there, claimed it. I think I had to pay a couple of ADA in terms of network and kind of processing minting fees, but it totally worked. And I got an NFT that, according to JPEG Store, actually has some real value. So this was kind of one of those nice days in crypto where just because of things that have happened in the past, I actually got something of real value. Finally, the Artifct Moon project had some big news today. They dropped an actual 3D map of all the parcels. Check this out. It's actually quite a beautiful little map. You can zoom in and out. It's very responsive. You can look at the dark side of the moon, the light side of the moon, and if you open this menu over here, you can see all of the parcels that are for sale. Each one of those little dots is a parcel for sale. If I click on this one right here, let's see if it actually works. There we go. And you can go directly to the page for that parcel. This has been a long time coming. I think we've wanted this for a long time, and the Artifct Moon project has been through some things. So I didn't know if we would ever actually see this day when there'd be an actual map with all the parcels. I haven't connected my own wallet to see if I can see my own parcels, but I think that will probably work too. Somebody will have to tell me if they've done it and if they can check out their own parcels. But happy to see some project progress out of Artifct Moon. I hope you're having a great week, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.